There were families that knew how to celebrate love, and then there were families like the Hawthorns, who knew only how to display it. From the outside, the Hawthorne estate looked like the kind of place magazines described with words like timeless and elegant, a long white house with black shutters, climbing ivy, and windows so perfectly polished they reflected the sky, like glass cut for royalty. On summer evenings, the lights along the drive came on all at once, soft and golden, as if the house itself had decided dusk should arrive in luxury. Strangers passing the gates would have assumed the people living there were refined, successful, and deeply connected to one another. They would have imagined candlelit dinners, laughter in the garden, family traditions preserved with tenderness and pride. They would have been wrong. Inside that house, love was never something you were given freely. It was something measured out according to usefulness, obedience, and appearance. If you made the family look good, you were cherished. If you complicated the picture, you were tolerated until someone found a more elegant way to push you to the edge of the frame. Adrian Hawthorne learned that long before he understood what ambition even was. As a boy, he thought his parents simply expected a lot from him. As a teenager, he realized they expected something far more specific than excellence. They expected alignment. They wanted a son who mirrored their taste, their politics, their chosen future, their sense of class. They wanted a boy who understood that the family name mattered more than personal truth. Adrian was not that boy. His older brother, Victor, had always been closer to what they wanted, polished, socially gifted, quick with a smile, skilled at turning every room into an audience. Their mother adored how easily Victor could charm people. Their father admired the way he spoke with confidence even when he had no idea what he was talking about. Victor learned early that certainty impressed people more than substance, and by the time he reached adulthood, he wore that lesson like a tailored suit. Adrian was different in all the ways the family found inconvenient. He asked questions when silence would have been more useful. He noticed hypocrisy too quickly and had never learned how to pretend not to. He was not rebellious in the theatrical way his father liked to condemn in other people's children. He was worse than rebellious. He was observant. He saw how his mother's kindness disappeared the second a guest left the room. He saw how his father spoke about loyalty while ranking his children by which one made him look stronger in public. He saw how Victor could be cruel in the softest voice possible and still be praised for his composure. The Hawthorns did not punish him for seeing these things. They punished him for not learning to call them by prettier names. Their father believed that a family should function like an institution. Discipline first, emotion second, reputation always. He spoke often about legacy, as if the word itself were holy. At the dinner table, he would remind his sons that the world respected winners and quietly discarded everyone else. Their mother believed in elegance with almost religious intensity. She corrected tone, posture, vocabulary, facial expressions, and even grief if she thought it looked undignified. Together, they created a home where every conversation felt lightly edited for public release. It was a beautiful place to visit and an exhausting place to grow up. The only person in the family who never made Adrian feel like a draft in need of revision was his grandmother, Margaret. She did not live in the estate. She lived in a smaller stone cottage beyond the orchard, on land older than the house and quieter than the people who claimed to own it. Her kitchen smelled like cedar, tea, and old paper. Her windows were often open. Her opinions always were. She had once told Adrian that some families used wealth the way poor men used noise, to make themselves feel larger than they were. He had laughed so hard he nearly spilled his tea, and she had smiled without apology. Margaret saw the Hawthorns clearly because she had watched them build themselves into performances one compromise at a time. She loved her grandson with a steadiness that felt almost radical in that bloodline. She never asked him to smile for effect. She never told him to be more diplomatic when he was wounded. She listened. In a family like his, listening was a greater act of love than praise. When Adrian was 16, he began spending most afternoons at her cottage under the excuse of helping with repairs. In truth, he went there to breathe. He would sand old shelves, fix loose hinges, carry firewood, and sit on the back steps while Margaret told him stories about people who had survived not because they were loved correctly, but because they had eventually stopped mistaking contempt for guidance. She never encouraged self-pity. She disliked self-pity almost as much as she disliked social climbing. But she understood the damage a person could suffer in a house that treated affection like a prize for performance. One evening, after Adrian had endured another dinner where Victor's success was praised by comparing it to Adrian's lack of polish, Margaret looked at him across the kitchen table and said, "You are not difficult, Adrian. You are simply expensive to control." He remembered that sentence for years. It was the first thing anyone had ever said that turned his shame into perspective. At 18, he left for university in Boston, partly because he wanted distance, partly because his father wanted him there, and partly because leaving felt like the only form of hope available to him then. The plan, at least according to the family, was obvious. Study finance, enter the family investment network, build something respectable with the Hawthorne name behind him. Victor had already chosen a more public life, branding, hospitality, event culture, the sort of glamorous industry their mother could photograph herself beside. Adrian was supposed to be the quieter son, the serious one, the one who made the numbers work behind the legacy. For a while he tried. He studied. He interned. He learned the language of capital, acquisition, risk, and control. He also learned something else. He was good at it, painfully good, not because of the family name, but because he could see where systems were lying to themselves. He knew how to spot waste dressed as prestige. He knew how to identify businesses that spent fortunes maintaining an illusion instead of building real stability. By 24, he was already advising people older than him who hated how often he was right. That should have made his father proud. Instead, it made him cautious. Adrian's intelligence was useful only when it stayed aligned with the family hierarchy. The first real break between them came when Adrian refused to bring a failing Hawthorne-owned events subsidiary under the family office without restructuring its leadership first. The company was losing money quietly but rapidly, buried beneath polished marketing, luxury imagery, and endless prestige spending that made Victor look successful while the numbers rotted underneath. Adrian reviewed the books for 3 nights in a row and concluded the problem was not market conditions or staff or timing. The problem was Victor. His brother was charming, visible, beloved at parties, and ruinously incompetent with actual operations. Adrian presented the findings in a private meeting with his father. He expected resistance. He did not expect the cold fury that followed. His father accused him of betrayal. His mother called him cruel for humiliating his brother with something as vulgar as spreadsheets. Victor leaned back in his chair and smiled in that almost sympathetic way he used when someone else was being quietly exiled from approval. He said Adrian had always confused criticism with intelligence. That day Adrian learned the one rule his family would never write down, but always obey. Truth was only welcome if it protected the right person. He left the family office within a month. Officially, the split was presented as independent ambition. Unofficially, he had become a problem. Calls went unanswered. Invitations thinned. Holidays grew quieter. His mother sent messages that sounded warm until read carefully. His father stopped offering advice and started offering silence. Victor, meanwhile, flourished in public. Magazine features, luxury weddings, charity galas, event partnerships, social media profiles filled with white roses, champagne towers, smiling couples, and captions about unforgettable love. Adrian watched from a distance and said nothing. He built his own firm instead, first small, then sharp, then impossible to ignore. What began as a boutique consultancy for underperforming private assets became an acquisitions group known for taking over distressed luxury businesses and rebuilding them with ruthless efficiency. Adrian did not chase publicity. He hated publicity. It reminded him too much of homes where appearance got promoted over truth. Instead, he built quietly through holding companies and private structures, buying things that looked glamorous from outside but were weaker than anyone wanted to admit. Hotels, venues, vendor groups, boutique logistics firms, event infrastructure. He learned that entire industries survived on image while bleeding cash underneath. He also learned that there was immense profit in seeing through velvet curtains. By the time he turned 33, Adrian had become richer than anyone in his family knew and more powerful than any of them would have guessed. He stayed private on purpose. He liked the way privacy protected him from becoming a public version of their values. The less they knew, the more honestly they revealed themselves whenever they did speak to him. And then, 3 weeks before the wedding, his mother called. It was late afternoon. Adrian was in his Manhattan office reviewing a portfolio proposal for a hospitality acquisition that included, among other assets, a cluster of historic venues along the East Coast. His assistant had just left with corrected contracts when his phone lit up with his mother's name. He stared at it long enough for the call to nearly die before answering. Her voice arrived polished, bright, and artificial in the exact way he remembered from childhood whenever she wanted something to sound joyful before he had agreed to provide it. She said she had wonderful news. Victor was getting married. Not someday, not eventually, but in less than a month, in the family's own grandest style, at the Hawthorne estate, with every important guest they had collected over 2 generations. Adrian listened without interrupting. His mother went on to say how beautiful it would be, how meaningful, how proud everyone was, how this wedding would be remembered for years. Then, finally, she reached the actual point of the call. She said the vendor situation had become complicated, budgets had expanded, expectations were high, and Victor was under stress. She said Adrian always understood logistics better than anyone. She said it would mean so much if he came home and helped in some way. Helped. In his family, that word had always meant rescue without recognition. Adrian asked whether Victor had requested this personally. There was a pause just long enough to answer the question without words. His mother said families should not keep score when important occasions were at stake. Adrian almost laughed. Important occasions had always been the family's favorite excuse for using him while pretending not to. He told her he would think about it. That evening he reviewed the details quietly through channels his family did not know he controlled. What he found interested him more than he expected. The wedding was bigger than even his mother had suggested. Much bigger. The estate itself was being transformed into a luxury event venue for the weekend, with temporary glass structures, imported florals, celebrity catering, custom lighting installations, private transport, premium staff, and hospitality contracts spread across multiple vendors. It was not merely expensive, it was unstable. Delayed invoices, weak vendor protections, last-minute financing, personal guarantees disguised as social confidence. And hidden beneath all of it was something more amusing than he would have believed if he had not seen it himself. The central event management company orchestrating the entire wedding weekend had been quietly bought out 6 months earlier by a holding group Adrian controlled. Victor did not know. His mother did not know. None of them knew that the company managing the staff, rentals, scheduling, staging, transport, and on-site authority for the entire wedding now answered, ultimately, to Adrian. He sat back in his chair and stared out at the city, the late sun reflecting off glass towers in pale gold. The situation would have been ridiculous even if it had involved strangers. In his own family, it felt inevitable. For years they had treated him as the son they called only when something real needed carrying. Now they were building the most important spectacle of Victor's life on top of a structure he already owned. 2 days later, his mother called again, this time softer, more urgent. She said the family would be deeply hurt if he refused to attend. She said his absence would create questions. She said Victor had enough pressure already without old resentments resurfacing. Adrian asked whether he was being invited as a brother or recruited as insurance. His mother replied in that wounded tone she used when honesty threatened her control and said she did not understand why he insisted on making everything so difficult. Adrian thought of his grandmother, of the cottage kitchen, of the sentence about being expensive to control. He said he would come. He did not tell her why. He booked a flight the same night. And for the first time in years, as he packed for home, he felt not dread exactly, but the cold anticipation of a man returning to a house that had once shaped his wounds and was about to discover it no longer shaped his power. By the time Adrian's car turned through the front gates of the Hawthorne estate, the sky above the property had already taken on the soft silver of early evening, and the house stood in the fading light like a monument to everything beautiful that could be built on top of emotional dishonesty. Even after all these years, the place knew how to make an entrance. The long gravel drive curved between trimmed hedges and low stone lanterns, past the south lawn where crews were already setting foundation panels for the clear reception pavilion, and toward the main house, its windows glowing with the kind of warm precision that made strangers think love lived easily inside. Adrian slowed the car as he approached the front steps, not because he needed time, but because part of him wanted to study the scene before stepping into it. Workers moved in carefully choreographed paths across the grounds. Floral crates were being unloaded. White seating structures had already been placed in rows along the garden terrace. Black-suited coordinators crossed the drive with tablets in hand. Temporary lighting rigs stood half-hidden behind trees. The wedding had not yet happened, but the performance was already well underway. He stepped out of the car, and the first thing he noticed was the smell: fresh-cut hydrangeas, damp grass, polished wood, expensive candles burning somewhere inside the house. The second thing he noticed was the tension. It lived beneath everything, beneath the floral beauty, beneath the efficient movement of staff, beneath the aesthetic calm his mother prized so much. Weddings, he had learned, were less about romance than about pressure revealing where a family was weakest. In the Hawthorne family, pressure had always been a truth serum. His mother appeared in the doorway before he had reached the steps, elegant as ever, in cream trousers and a pale silk blouse, her hair perfectly arranged, her smile already activated. She descended 2 steps toward him with her arms slightly open, as though motherhood could be resumed through posture alone. Adrian kissed her cheek because that was easier than refusing, and she held him just half a second too long, not from affection, but from relief. She said she was so glad he came. He answered that he was sure she was. Her expression tightened imperceptibly, then reset. She asked about the drive, the flight, the city, all the little surface things people use when they're trying not to name what actually matters. Adrian let her lead him inside. The house looked even more prepared than the grounds. Staff moved through the halls carrying garment bags, floral runners, trays of tasting samples, stationery folders, and narrow boxes marked fragile in black ink. The drawing room had been turned into a temporary planning suite. The library was stacked with seating charts, vendor binders, ribbon samples, monogram proofs, and emergency kits. 2 assistants he did not recognize were whispering over a timeline board larger than a painting. It all would have impressed him more if he had not known exactly how much of the operation sat beneath a corporate structure his family assumed belonged to someone else. His mother kept speaking while they walked, about timing, guests, weather forecasts, the rehearsal dinner, and the florist's indecision about imported roses. Adrian listened in fragments. He had always noticed that his mother became more talkative as situations became less controllable. Words were the silk she wrapped around panic. When they reached the central hall, Victor came down the staircase laughing into his phone, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke to someone who was almost certainly being charmed into solving one of his problems. He saw Adrian midway down, ended the call with practiced ease, and smiled with that familiar brightness that managed to look both warm and competitive at the same time. He came forward for an embrace, and Adrian accepted it the way one accepts a ceremonial gesture from a diplomat one does not trust. Victor said it meant a lot that he had come. Adrian told him that weddings did tend to reveal who was willing to show up when things became complicated. Victor laughed, either missing the point or deciding not to acknowledge it. Time had been kind to him in the superficial ways that mattered most to people like their mother. He was handsome, well-groomed, socially effortless, exactly the sort of groom luxury magazines like to photograph beside champagne towers and candlelight. Yet standing this close, Adrian saw what he had always seen beneath the surface: restlessness, vanity, the confidence of a man who had spent so long being shielded from consequences that he sometimes mistook attention for competence. Victor asked if their mother had explained the schedule, the guest lists, the pressure, the ridiculous scale of everything. He said it all with a grin, as though chaos were proof of importance. Then, lowering his voice just enough to suggest intimacy without actually becoming sincere, he said he was glad Adrian was here because no one handled crises like he did. Adrian almost smiled at that. It was classic Victor, treating usefulness like brotherhood and assuming the difference would go unnoticed. Before Adrian could answer, footsteps sounded from the back corridor and the bride entered the hall. Her name was Celeste Ashford, daughter of a hotel family with enough old money to be respected by their mother and enough new visibility to excite Victor. Adrian had met her only twice before, both times at public events where she had seemed graceful, intelligent, and slightly more observant than the people around her realized. Up close, she was striking without being ornamental, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of still gaze that suggested she missed very little. She greeted Adrian warmly, and unlike his mother and brother, Her warmth did not feel strategic. She said she was happy he had come because Victor had been speaking about him for days in a way that implied they were much closer than reality probably justified. Adrian looked at Victor, who smiled without shame. Celeste noticed the look and laughed under her breath. Good, Adrian thought. At least someone in this house still recognized performance when it entered the room dressed as affection. Dinner that evening was smaller than the coming wedding events, but formal enough to be tiring. Their father sat at the head of the table, heavier now, slower perhaps, but still carrying himself with the same rigid authority that had shaped the emotional climate of Adrian's childhood. He greeted Adrian with a handshake instead of an embrace. Some distances, even time, did not soften into anything more human. The meal unfolded in the old Hawthorne rhythm, polished conversation, selective admiration, and beneath it all the quiet ranking of value. Victor's engagement story had already been told too many times and was told again. Their mother described the wedding weekend as if narrating a royal summit. Their father asked pointed questions about market conditions and capital structures, clearly more comfortable discussing leverage than family. Adrian answered as little as possible while learning more from what others said when they assumed he was half listening. There were vendor delays, a floral dispute, a transportation issue with guest arrivals, temporary staff turnover, a problem with table installations on the east lawn because of weight distribution after the last rain. Their mother called these small inconveniences. Victor called them annoying. Adrian called them exactly what they were in his head: operational consequences of building a fantasy event on top of sloppy infrastructure. Still, he said nothing. Let them reveal the shape of the mess themselves. It was after dessert that their mother finally asked, with studied casualness, whether Adrian might take a look at the event flow tomorrow morning. She said it as if asking for a second opinion, not intervention. Victor added that the planning team was excellent, but sometimes too timid to make decisive calls. Their father said that if Adrian saw any obvious inefficiencies, it would be useful to have them corrected before guests began arriving in full. No one said help us. No one said we need you. In the Hawthorne household, dependence was always translated into evaluation. Adrian folded his napkin, set it beside his plate, and said he would review whatever had been prepared. Their mother smiled with visible relief. Victor raised his glass. Their father nodded once, the closest he came to gratitude. Adrian wondered, not for the first time, whether they would have loved him differently if he had been less necessary. The next morning began before sunrise for most of the estate staff, though not for the family. Adrian had always preferred the hours before performance woke up. He dressed, walked the grounds alone, and watched the event machine gather itself into motion. Catering trucks arrived through the service lane. Floral teams entered the garden terraces with rolling carts. Staging crews adjusted sightlines in the reception pavilion. Security checked credentials at the rear gate. Everywhere he looked, he saw competence at the worker level and vanity at the planning level. Exactly the pattern that usually preceded expensive failures. At 7:30, he stepped into the main planning room, where a dozen people were already working around coffee cups and open binders. Conversations paused when he entered. Some faces registered mild confusion, others recognition, though not of his identity exactly. They recognized authority when it entered a room without introducing itself too loudly. The lead on-site coordinator, a woman named Marianne whom Adrian knew by reputation, but who did not know who he was beyond the groom's brother, approached with the careful professionalism of someone already exhausted by wealthy clients. She offered him a summary of current issues. Adrian listened, then started asking questions. Precise questions. Questions about contingency plans, transport sequencing, power draw, weather flex timing, guest flow bottlenecks, staff ratios, access permissions, and the backup kitchen route should the west service corridor become unusable during the reception turnover. Within 10 minutes, the room changed. People sat straighter. Assistants stopped pretending the binders were enough. Marianne's expression moved from polite patience to sharp attention. Adrian could feel it happening. That familiar shift when a chaotic system realizes someone has arrived who actually understands how all the moving parts relate to one another. He reviewed timelines, restructured the arrival schedule, reassigned support staff, identified 2 decorative installations that were increasing risk without adding value, and asked who had approved a transport loop so inefficient it practically guaranteed delays. A silence followed that question. Then Victor entered the room with coffee in hand, still charming, still relaxed, and said he had approved it because it looked more elegant on the original concept sketch. Adrian turned and looked at him for a long second. Around them, several staff members became suddenly very interested in their papers. Adrian asked whether elegance had become the operating metric for vehicle throughput. Victor smiled, but the smile carried strain now. He said this was not a military operation. Adrian replied that any event handling hundreds of guests, external vendors, infrastructure shifts, and family expectations across 3 days was, in fact, exactly that. Celeste entered halfway through the exchange and stood quietly near the doorway, listening. Victor tried to recover by joking that Adrian was always happier when he could turn beauty into a logistics diagram. Adrian answered that beauty without structure usually collapsed in front of witnesses. That landed. Not loudly, but enough. Celeste's eyes flickered toward Victor with a look Adrian could not fully read. Marianne cleared her throat and suggested they proceed through the updated flow. For the next hour, Adrian worked the room as if it were one of his own assets, because in a way it was. He reallocated labor, cut unnecessary complexity, and quietly removed 3 points of failure before anyone less experienced could insist on preserving them for aesthetic reasons. By the end of the meeting, the staff trusted him more than they trusted the family, and worse for the family, they trusted him openly. Victor noticed. Their mother noticed too when she arrived late, expecting to float above the process and discovering instead that the process had reorganized itself around Adrian. She masked her discomfort well, asking sweetly whether everything was under control now. Adrian said it was improving. She thanked him with just enough warmth to sound gracious and just enough restraint to remind the room that he was still, in her hierarchy, a secondary son. He had not missed that tone in all the years away. He had only stopped reacting to it as if it meant anything. By early afternoon, the estate was filling with arriving relatives, pre-wedding guests, stylists, groomsmen, and family friends whose primary contribution to any event was being seen at it. Adrian moved through the house with increasing detachment, speaking when useful, observing always, noting where the family drama was beginning to collect. His Aunt Delilah had already started making remarks about table placement. 2 cousins were arguing quietly about room assignments. Their father was annoyed with the valet setup because he felt the primary entrance should have been reserved more visibly for the right arrivals. Victor was being photographed in the south garden while a production assistant nearly cried over missing boutonnieres. Through all of it, Celeste remained composed. She thanked staff by name. She noticed when people were overworked. She asked practical questions instead of ornamental ones. Adrian found himself respecting her more with each passing hour and wondering, not for the first time, what exactly she believed she was marrying into. That evening, just before the rehearsal dinner began, he found her alone for a moment near the greenhouse path, holding her shoes in one hand while an assistant searched the gravel for a dropped earring back. She looked up when he approached and smiled with tired honesty rather than ceremony. She said he had already saved the weekend twice, and it was only Friday. Adrian told her the weekend had not required saving so much as adult supervision. She laughed then, a real laugh, not the strategic kind. After a pause, she asked him something no one in his family ever asked directly. She asked why he had really come. Adrian considered lying, then decided she had earned better than that. He said he came because his mother asked, because Victor assumed he would, and because some part of him wanted to see whether the family could host a wedding without turning dependence into humiliation. Celeste's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show the sentence had confirmed something she had already suspected. She looked toward the house, where warm lights were coming on room by room. Then she said, very quietly, that Victor had spoken often about how hard the family had been on Adrian when they were younger, but always in a way that suggested it was all behind them now. Adrian asked if she believed him. She hesitated. Then she said she believed families were best understood by watching what happened when things went wrong, not by listening to how they described themselves when everything looked beautiful. Adrian almost smiled. She was sharper than Victor deserved. Before either of them could say more, an assistant arrived with the recovered earring back, and the moment ended. But something remained with him after she walked away, a suspicion that the wedding weekend was not going to collapse because of vendors, timing, or weather. It was going to collapse because too many truths were already standing just beneath the surface, waiting for the right pressure to split the room open. The rehearsal dinner that night was held beneath the half-finished glass pavilion, now lit with suspended candles and low amber fixtures that made the structure glow against the dark lawn like a jewel box placed in the middle of the estate. Guests praised the beauty, the flowers, the view, the linen texture, the musicians. Their mother moved through the evening like a queen, inspecting the result of her own taste. Victor gave speeches. Their father gave a toast about legacy and the strength of families who built carefully and loved with seriousness. Adrian nearly laughed into his wine at that. Then his mother stood and thanked everyone involved in making the weekend possible. She thanked vendors, planners, relatives, sponsors, old friends, new partners, and finally, in a tone so light it almost disappeared under the clink of cutlery, she thanked Adrian for helping smooth a few final details. Adrian sat very still. Across the table, Victor smiled as if that phrasing were generous. Their father nodded once, already moving on in his mind to his next conversation. Celeste noticed. He could tell she noticed because her eyes flicked toward him and stayed there half a second too long. Adrian lifted his glass, but said nothing. He had spent too many years in this family to confuse undercrediting with accident. It was part of the house style. Use the useful son. Minimize the debt. Preserve the hierarchy. The old version of him might have let that reopen something raw. The current version only filed it away. After dinner, as guests drifted into conversation and the musicians shifted into softer music under the glass roof, Victor approached Adrian with a whiskey in hand and the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the evening had gone well enough to permit private condescension. He clapped him once on the shoulder and said he knew their mother could be difficult about acknowledgement, but Adrian shouldn't take it personally. He said some people were simply better suited to supporting roles, and if Adrian was honest, logistics had always been where he shined. It was almost impressive how naturally Victor could turn dependence into hierarchy. Adrian looked at his brother, at the expensive suit, the loosened tie, the groom's ease, the smugness earned entirely from a system built to protect him, and said in an even voice that support roles only looked small to people who had never understood what was actually holding up the room. Victor smiled, but there was discomfort in it now. He asked whether Adrian had come home just to be bitter. Adrian answered no. He had come home because weddings revealed things. Then he walked away before Victor could ask what exactly that meant. Later that night, in the privacy of the guest wing room where he was staying, Adrian received a message from his chief operations counsel in New York. It was brief. Ownership review complete. Final vendor controls confirmed. Weekend authority remains with our structure unless extraordinary intervention required. He read it once, then set the phone down on the bedside table and looked out through the window at the glowing estate below. The entire wedding machine, all its luxury, all its choreography, all its silent assumptions about who was above whom, rested inside a structure his family still believed they controlled socially and symbolically. But control, Adrian had learned, was never about who made the loudest speeches or stood nearest the altar. It was about who held the actual leverage when illusion finally met consequence. And by the time he turned off the light and lay back in the quiet dark, he knew with complete certainty that the weekend was moving toward exactly that collision. By Saturday morning, the estate had become a living machine. Cars moved in measured waves through the gate. Makeup artists, stylists, photographers, florists, caterers, musicians, drivers, and planners all moved along invisible tracks held together by timing, money, and the quiet fear of disappointing powerful people. The Hawthorne family thrived in that atmosphere because it looked so much like control, but Adrian knew the difference between control and presentation. Presentation smiled. Control checked backup generators, weather contingencies, staffing redundancies, and whether the couple arriving at sunset would still have chairs that had not sunk into softened ground. He was up before 6, not because anyone asked him to be, but because years in operations had taught him that the true story of any event appeared before the guests woke. He walked the grounds in a dark coat with a coffee in hand, while the air still carried the cool dampness of dawn. Staff had already begun rerouting service carts away from the eastern lawn after the night's humidity softened the edge near the garden path. The pavilion lights were being tested. The ceremony chairs were still covered, pale rose waiting in silence beneath the old maples. In another life, in another family, he might have found the scene moving. But in the Hawthorne estate, beauty had always arrived with a bill, and someone else usually paid for what the family later claimed as effortless grace. By 7:30, the main house was awake in stages. Victor's groomsmen had taken over the west wing with noise, cologne, and the kind of careless confidence men perform for each other when they think commitment has not yet fully become real. The bridal suite on the upper floor glowed with lamplight and urgency. Half a dozen women moving around Celeste with garment steamers and velvet boxes and whispered schedules. Their mother crossed the central hall like a woman trying to direct both weather and bloodline with the same fixed smile. Their father stood near the breakfast room, speaking sharply into his phone about parking overflow and preferred entrances, as though social hierarchy could be protected by controlling which cars were seen first. Adrian watched all of it while reviewing the updated event reports Marianne had sent before dawn. Two things had changed overnight. The floral installation over the rear terrace was heavier than planned, which had affected load timing for the support rig, and one of the private transport vendors had missed a staging checkpoint, which meant some guest arrivals would compress dangerously if the route was not adjusted before noon. Neither issue was catastrophic yet. Both were exactly the kind of thing that turned into catastrophe when wealthy people assumed aesthetic confidence could substitute for systems. Adrian forwarded a brief correction memo through the management line, not as family, not as guest, but through the structure that actually held authority. Then he went downstairs. The breakfast room held the usual surface intimacy his family liked staging for special days. Fine china, soft music, sun through linen curtains. Victor, already dressed in a partially buttoned shirt with an espresso in hand, laughing too loudly at something one of his friends had said. Their mother looked luminous and brittle. Their father looked displeased by something too small to justify the amount of irritation he clearly felt. When Adrian entered, conversation shifted just enough to acknowledge him without warmly including him. That had always been the family's preferred technique. They did not exclude openly. They simply reduced oxygen in the room until your presence felt like an administrative complication. Their mother smiled and asked whether he had managed to sleep at all with so much activity. Adrian said fine. Victor joked that Adrian probably slept better around logistics than around feelings. One of the groomsmen laughed too quickly. Adrian poured coffee and sat without comment. Then their father asked, in the tone of someone assigning relevance, whether everything was on track or whether he expected another crisis involving trucks and chairs. Adrian looked at him for a moment and said that most crises began when people underestimated the importance of trucks and chairs. Victor smirked. Their mother sighed softly, the sound she used whenever she wanted tension to appear childish instead of deserved. She said today was not the day for Adrian to be difficult. There it was. No matter how much he solved, how much he stabilized, how much of the weekend rested invisibly on his judgment, one sentence from his mother could still reduce him in family language to the son who complicated things by refusing to smile on command. Adrian set down his cup and asked what exactly he had done that morning that counted as difficult. Their mother held his gaze only briefly before looking away to adjust a napkin that did not need adjusting. She said she simply meant emotions were running high and it would help if everyone stayed supportive. Supportive. Again that word. Always meaning silent when insulted, useful when needed, grateful when minimized. Victor leaned back and added with an easy grin that no one wanted one of Adrian's truth speeches before the ceremony. That got another laugh from his friend. Adrian looked at his brother and for a second saw not a groom, not a successful man, not even an adult, but the same boy who had learned long ago that if he made the family laugh first, he would never have to be the one under the knife. Adrian said nothing more. Silence, he had discovered, frightened the right people far more than indignation ever had. The morning moved quickly after that. Guests expanded across the property. The bride's extended family arrived in waves of polished warmth and expensive restraint. Photographers floated like ghosts through the hallways. Their mother corrected floral height ratios in the drawing room while claiming she trusted the experts. Their father complained about a donor-level guest being seated 3 rows farther back than expected. Victor disappeared for an hour and re-emerged laughing, half-ready, somehow both late and unconcerned. Through it all, Adrian remained where the actual pressure lived, inside corridors, operations tents, service lanes, quiet corners where staff made reality possible. He noticed Mary Ann becoming more tense by the hour, noticed two junior coordinators near tears over a delayed custom linen delivery, noticed a catering lead recalculating plate timing because the champagne reception had stretched 7 minutes beyond plan. None of that bothered him. Events breathe like this. What bothered him was the accumulating emotional pressure inside the family. He could feel it the way sailors feel weather before the sky changes. Their mother had become sharper. Their father had started using command tones with people who were not his employees. Victor's charm was beginning to flicker at the edges, which usually meant his control was more fragile than it looked. And Celeste, for all her composure, had grown quieter. Around noon, Adrian found her standing alone for a moment behind the orangery, away from cameras and bridesmaids and decorative urgency. She was in a silk robe, her hair half-styled, one earring missing, one hand pressed lightly against the stone wall, as if borrowing steadiness from it. When she saw him, she smiled, but it did not reach her eyes quickly enough. Adrian asked whether she was all right. She answered with the kind of honesty people only use when they are already too tired to perform. She said she was fine in the way women in expensive weddings often say they are fine, while swallowing 10 different forms of discomfort to keep everyone else's illusion intact. Adrian did not challenge the answer immediately. He simply stood there a moment, letting the silence offer her something different from pressure. Finally, she said she had never realized until that weekend how many people wanted the wedding more than they wanted the marriage. The sentence hung between them. Adrian looked toward the rear lawns where crews adjusted ivory drapery against the breeze and said that some families loved events because events could be photographed from flattering angles. Lives were harder. Celeste gave a short, tired laugh. Then, quieter, she admitted that Victor had been impossible the night before, distracted, vain, careless with her stress, and when she tried to tell him how overwhelmed she felt, he had kissed her forehead and said she was overthinking the details because everything would look perfect by evening. Adrian recognized that kind of cruelty. Not loud, not explicit. The cruelty of refusing to take another person's reality seriously because your own comfort depended on calling it mood. He asked whether she wanted this day. Not the flowers, not the guests, not the magazines their mothers would no doubt send the photos to. The day itself, the marriage. Celeste looked at him a long time before answering. Then she said she thought she had wanted Victor, but she was beginning to understand that wanting the polished version of someone in public was not the same as trusting who they became under pressure in private. Before Adrian could respond, one of her bridesmaids appeared around the hedge looking panicked about missing hairpins, and the moment vanished. But not completely. The question remained in the air after she left, and Adrian carried it with him as he returned to the main house. The ceremony itself was scheduled for late afternoon. By 2, the estate had crossed the line where an event becomes less preparation than momentum. There was no pausing it now. Musicians tuned. Ushers took positions. Guest transport loops tightened. Champagne was chilled in silver-lined crates. The gardens looked impossible. White roses, pale peonies, trailing greenery, cream silk ribbons moving softly in the wind. The family name had never looked more beautiful. It had also never looked more expensive to maintain. The first real crack came not from weather or logistics, but from seating. Of all the absurd things to trigger it, it was seating. Their mother discovered that Adrian had not been placed at the family front table for the reception dinner. He was at a nearby table, prominent enough to seem included, peripheral enough to reinforce the hierarchy. She claimed it was an oversight. Adrian knew better immediately. Oversights in his family always seemed to fall along perfectly familiar fault lines. Victor, when confronted, shrugged and said the table was already full with people more central to the day. His tone made it worse than the words. More central, as if Adrian were an elegant vendor rather than the groom's brother. Their mother intervened before the conversation could sharpen publicly. She said she was sure Adrian understood these things were complicated, that event seating was a nightmare, that no insult had been intended. Their father, overhearing only part of it, said sharply that if Adrian planned to make himself the story on Victor's wedding day, he could leave now and spare everyone the strain. The words landed in the small service hallway behind the reception pavilion where only a handful of staff were present, but that made them worse, not better. Private humiliations in the Hawthorne family were never truly private. They were the foundation under every public smile. Adrian looked at his father for a long moment. There it was again, the old family equation. Use him when needed. Reduce him when visible. Threaten exile the second he made unfairness inconvenient to ignore. He asked whether that was genuinely how his father wanted to handle the matter. His father straightened and said he would not have his younger son poisoning the atmosphere because he was not the center of attention for once. Victor laughed once under his breath, not because anything was funny, but because contempt had become reflex around his brother whenever the family rewarded it. Their mother told Adrian not to be dramatic. Marianne appeared at the far end of the corridor then, stopping instantly when she sensed the tone. Two servers passing with polished glassware slowed their steps. Everyone present pretended not to be listening. Adrian said, calmly enough to make all of them more uncomfortable, that he had no interest in being the center of attention. What he objected to was being treated like a utility in private and an inconvenience in public by the same people, often within the same hour. Their father's face hardened. He said if Adrian could not show basic humility at his own brother's wedding, he was welcome to leave the estate immediately. The sentence landed with full force now because this time it was unmistakable, not implied exclusion, not elegant. Minimization, a direct order to leave. Their mother, instead of correcting it, went still. Victor did not defend him. He only adjusted his cuff and looked away, as if the moment were distasteful but not actionable. Adrian felt something old and dangerous try to rise in him. Not anger exactly, but the ancient exhaustion of being asked to save structures that still found him disposable. He looked from his father to his mother to Victor, and what struck him was not their hostility. It was their certainty. Even now, with the entire wedding running on systems they did not understand and control they had not actually built, they still believed the hierarchy of the house could overrule everything. Celeste entered the corridor just in time to catch the silence after the sentence. She looked from face to face and asked what was happening. No one answered immediately. Their mother said too quickly that it was nothing, just stress. Adrian turned to Celeste and said her future father-in-law had just invited him to leave the wedding because apparently asking not to be seated like hired help counted as theatrical behavior. Celeste went very still. Victor muttered that Adrian was twisting the moment. Adrian asked whether he was. Their father snapped that he would not be spoken to like this on family property. There, Adrian thought. Family property. The phrase nearly made him smile. Because that, more than anything, was the illusion holding them upright, the belief that the estate, the event, the structure, the authority, all of it was naturally theirs to command. Marianne was still standing at the end of the corridor, frozen between retreat and duty. Adrian noticed her, noticed the staff nearby, noticed how quickly a family myth could be seen clearly once other people stood close enough to watch it crack. Their mother stepped forward and said in a low, urgent voice that Adrian was upsetting Celeste, upsetting the timeline, upsetting everyone, and perhaps leaving for a few hours would indeed be best if he could not regain perspective. It was almost elegant, how she turned expulsion into concern. Victor then did the cruelest thing of all. He smiled at Celeste, put one hand lightly at the center of her back, and said, "This is why Adrian was never good with family events. He always confuses support with importance." The line was soft, almost affectionate in tone. It might have passed as harmless to strangers. To Adrian it was perfect. It contained the whole history. Usefulness without acknowledgement. Presence without belonging. Labor without seat or name. Celeste looked at Victor, and for the first time since the weekend began, Adrian saw something like alarm enter her expression. Not at Adrian. At Victor. At the ease with which he had diminished his own brother in front of others while expecting to remain charming. Adrian took one slow breath. Then another. He said, "All right." That confused them more than resistance would have. Their father frowned. Their mother blinked. Victor's hand fell from Celeste's back. Adrian nodded once, almost politely, and said if they truly wanted him gone, they should be very certain they understood what exactly they were asking to leave. The sentence changed the air at once. Not because they understood it, but because they felt the weight in it. Their father told him not to threaten people in his own house. Adrian replied that he was not threatening anyone. He was giving them the courtesy of clarity they had not shown him. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him he could hear their mother say his name sharply, their father curse under his breath, Victor mutter something about ego. He kept walking. Not to the gates. Not to his car. He walked toward the operations suite. The service corridor there was cooler, quieter, full of the low concentrated tension of real work. When Adrian entered, Marianne looked up immediately. So did the logistics supervisor, the guest transport lead, and two of the senior floor managers. They had all heard enough, or guessed enough, to know something had shifted. Adrian asked for a private room. Marianne led him into the side office used for vendor command. Inside, walls were lined with timelines, property maps, staff charts, emergency protocols, and live movement updates. It was, Adrian thought, the first truly honest room on the estate. Marianne asked whether there was a problem. Adrian looked at her and said there might be. Then he asked a question that made her go still. He asked whether she had ever been formally informed who sat at final authority above the event group managing the weekend. Marianne hesitated. She said ownership was handled through a holding structure and that they had direct contacts only at the executive operations level. Adrian nodded and gave her the parent company name, then the subsidiary, then the private control entity above both. Marianne's expression changed slowly as recognition arranged itself across her face. She asked, almost carefully, whether he was telling her that he was the principal controlling owner. Adrian said yes. The room became very quiet. Outside the door, someone rolled a cart past with crystal stems rattling lightly against padding. Marianne sat down without meaning to. For a moment, she looked less shocked than embarrassed, as though she had suddenly realized how many times she had explained pieces of his own structure to him like an efficient stranger. Adrian assured her she had done exactly what she was supposed to do. Then he told her what had just happened in the family corridor. He did not dramatize it. He did not need to. Marianne listened with the face of a woman recalculating an entire weekend in real time. When he finished, she asked what he wanted to do. Adrian looked at the maps on the wall, the guest flows, the ceremony timing, the transport routes, the pavilion schedule, the entire gorgeous machinery of Victor's wedding, balanced on contracts, clearances, approvals, insurance, staffing, authority. All of it answerable, in the final line, to him. He said not yet. Not publicly. Not until he was sure. Marianne asked sure of what? Adrian thought of Celeste near the orangery, of Victor in the corridor, of his father saying leave, of his mother's smoothing expulsion into etiquette. He said he wanted to know whether the family merely wanted him invisible or whether they truly believed the event could proceed cleanly after throwing him out. Marianne understood more than he said. She asked whether she should pause any discretionary authorizations. Adrian said yes. Quietly. No dramatic failure. No scene. Just a temporary hold on non-essential release points until he gave further instruction. She nodded, already moving into professional mode. But before she could stand, he added one more thing. If anyone from the Hawthorne family asked why timeline adjustments were suddenly tightening, she was to say only that ownership review required confirmation before final release. The words were clinical. The effect would not be. By the time Adrian stepped back out into the corridor, the wedding grounds still looked perfect. Guests still smiled. Musicians still played. White flowers still glowed against green. But beneath the beauty, tiny pressure points had begun to freeze. And as he crossed the lawn alone, he knew the next hour would decide whether this remained a painful family insult or became something much larger. A public reckoning no chandelier, no speech, no bloodline polish would be able to soften once it began. And as he crossed the lawn alone, he knew the next hour would decide whether this remained a painful family insult or became something much larger. A public reckoning no chandelier, no speech, no bloodline polish would be able to soften once it began.